Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second of our series of lectures on road safety. Today, I'm really pleased to have with me Chief Superintendent Mark Clothier from Sussex Police. I suppose this afternoon's item for discussion is around the upcoming police enforcement campaign around the Fatal Four. Mark, I'll allow you to enlighten us with regard to that in a minute. But if I can first ask you just to introduce yourself for the people listening, and then we'll take it from there.
Thanks, Alan. So just to introduce myself then, Mark Clothier. I'm a Chief Superintendent from Sussex Police, but I'm currently seconded as the head of NRPOI. NRPOI is an abbreviation for the National Roads Policing Operations, Intelligence and Investigation Working Group. It's a short title, as you can tell, but I suppose just to provide some clarity, essentially I'm the operational lead for the NPCC, National Police Chiefs Council, roads policing portfolio. So that involves trying to coordinate and deliver across 45 police forces and with a whole range of strategic partners the current NPCC roads policing strategy.
Yeah, I must admit, coordinating across 45 forces in itself must be a mammoth task. But if you could probably tell us, I know the upcoming I suppose enforcement campaign around the Fatal Four starts in April. So what is it? What does it focus on, and why is it so important to road safety?
Yeah. Okay. So the operation that's due to start at the beginning of April is Operation Spotlight. That's an operation across the whole of the UK that forms part of our annual calendar of campaigns and activities. It's focused on the Fatal Four because the Fatal Four are driving behaviours, essentially, which cause the highest number of deaths and serious injuries on the roads. And to give you some context, and also perhaps a little bit of irony in relation to that, is we see on average approximately 4 deaths every day, and somebody's killed or seriously injured approximately every 17 minutes. So that's the reason, I guess, why those Fatal Four are focused on by police and partners. The Fatal Four, and to just run through those with you, are driving under the influence of drink or drugs, mobile phone use or distraction would be another terminology for that, speeding, and not wearing a seatbelt. And then the other thing I'd probably just clarify, Alan, because I think it's worth doing, is that some forces, and equally I know some other organisations, will refer to the Fatal Five. But I think we accept at NPCC that there may be some local influence on that. There may be slightly different choices with different forces, but quite often that fifth element may be the sort of careless, inconsiderate or dangerous driving behaviour. But all behaviours that drivers choose to do.
Lovely. Thanks for that introduction, Mark. That's really, really good. Why do you think, even after all of these years, I mean, seatbelt, for example, seatbelt legislation came in, 42 years ago now? So 1983 we started to see the first, was it 83? I think it was 83, wasn't it? And why is it that we still fail to recognise the safety of actually just belting up before we drive off?
I think that's a really good question, Alan, and I can probably say that I wasn't driving in 1983, so that was a little bit before my time. But I guess I do remember kind of casting my mind back to that sort of clunk, click every trip, I think was the slogan that was launched with the campaign then. I guess I've grown up and started my driving career with that sort of mentality that you always get in the vehicle and put your seatbelt on before you move away. And I find it shocking that people still get in a vehicle, whether it's behind the wheel or as a passenger, and don't wear a seatbelt, and the increased risk that puts you at. I think you've talked about kind of the overarching figures, but I think the figures, particularly in relation to young people and particularly young males, are really high. And I guess just to talk about personal experience, visited the scene of a potential fatal in Brighton, literally within the last few weeks, where sadly the person who was most injured out of that vehicle, and there were a number of young people in that vehicle, but the person who was most injured had been ejected from that vehicle, and that's probably because they weren't wearing a seatbelt at the time of that collision took place. So there is a really increased risk that if you're involved in a collision and you're not wearing your seatbelt, that level of injury is going to be much greater. And I do find it quite shocking that drivers and passengers still get in a vehicle and don't wear them.
Yeah. Do you think that I think lots of this comes down to complacency and an expectation that I'm safe in my box as I move around. So do you think we could do more to, I suppose, raise awareness? When I look across the world at different types of advertising campaigns, I see, for example, in the Southern Hemisphere, they're quite hard hitting the way that they market there. Do you think that would work here, or do you think we really need to just educate better?
I think there's a real balance there. So I think it's absolutely legitimate that we use a range of tactics. So whether that is education, whether it is enforcement, both of those I think have got their part to play. I think how we deliver that message is fascinating. And I think when you listen to some of the academics in this space and the work and the research that's taken place, I think we're moving away from probably that shock and trying to scare people, because certainly there are some very credible academics who would say that that's not the right way to influence people in the right way. But you're right, we absolutely need to raise awareness of this. I think we need to focus our activity quite rightly on those areas that create the greatest risk. Hence one of the reasons why we do this operation, why we work with partners. And part of that isn't just around that enforcement, it is absolutely about that education and that right messaging as well. So part of, again, the operation is around making sure that we're putting out messaging through the media, raising awareness, because actually the most important thing for me is that prevention aspect. And I would much rather that somebody put their seatbelt on as a result of seeing a message or seeing some local media, as opposed to being caught at the roadside and given a fixed penalty notice, or obviously being involved in a collision and being more injured than they would have been had they been wearing their seatbelt.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And, totally concur with what you say there. Moving on, when we start looking at, as we say, the four critical types of behaviour that we're talking about within this operation, they're all choices, effectively. They're all actually choices that a driver's going to take. Is there, excess speed, over 2 million people receiving penalty notices on an annual basis. Do you think there's a way that we can make that any better? We can improve that? Because, everywhere you go, there's so much support now to stop you from speeding, yet we still make the choice. So as a police, it must be so frustrating to be in that position on a daily basis.
Well, and I think we've talked about the fatal four. You've moved on to specifically speeding, but I think all these behaviours that we're talking here are around personal choice, aren't they? And I think the other thing I'd probably just come back to that you mentioned a minute ago, Alan, was that, I guess, complacency being inside a box, I think was your terminology. But I guess the other bit for me would be that sort of perception that this isn't going to happen to me. It always happens to somebody else. But I think I've touched on some of the figures already. But when you look at nearly 30,000 people who are killed or seriously injured every year, give or take, that is a shockingly high number of people. And we also know the devastation that causes not only to those who are involved in the collisions, but family, friends, my colleagues who go out and deal with those collisions. And you're right, it is a choice. And I think there are a number of aspects to that. So I'd be really happy if we were sitting here and having a discussion that said, actually, we're on a trajectory where in 2 years' time we'll not be prosecuting anybody for speeding because everybody's compliant. And how do we change that culture, which is that people get in a vehicle and choose to drive in that way? And that's a really difficult one, isn't it?
Yeah, Absolutely. And, I know that we've got the driver rehabilitation programs, particularly in relation to speeding. And there were, from a personal perspective, I think we saw quite a lot of improvement initially. Do you think that's softened over the years? Do you think there's more of an acceptance that actually, if I do this, I can get away with things? Or, what do you think you see on a, from a, I suppose from an enforcement perspective, really?
I think one of the real strengths to the enforcement around speed in the UK is that graduated approach.
Mm.
And I think that opportunity to educate drivers through the speed awareness course, obviously delivered by UK Road, is a really good opportunity, and something that the academic research again would tell us is better than punishing people and giving them points and
Yeah.
a fine. I think there's then a stepped approach, isn't there, to people being issued with points, and obviously if they tot up, we will see people lose their licenses, or equally, I guess. And the other bit for me is where we're focusing our efforts around those who create the greatest risk on our roads, is that those people who deliberately choose to go out and take part in behaviour that's particularly risky, and I'm talking about those people who drive at really high speeds, those people who perhaps take drink or drugs and are driving at high speed, or are driving at high speed and filming themselves on their mobile phone, as we've seen a number of recent
Yeah.
cases, then absolutely in those cases, it's right that they get dealt with in a much more robust fashion right from the start because of the increased risk that they pose. So I guess that range of tactics and that graduated enforcement for me, with education, which we've talked about already as an option to change behaviour, again another one of the strands within the National Roads Policing strategy, is really, really important.
I think, when I look at it from an external perspective now, which is, sort of quite interesting to have that different view from my perspective. I certainly, when I talk to drivers now, there seems to be much more of an acceptance around things like seatbelt use, speeding even, than potentially, the drug driving type of aspect. There's something negative in the connotation by that, but people seem to accept speeding on, oh, he's only not wearing a seatbelt. It's acceptable. Is that something you come into contact with?
I think so. That's a fascinating question, isn't it? Because I think we would sit here and talk about particularly drink driving, I think, being socially unacceptable. Albeit we still see a relatively high number of people who will get behind the wheel having made that choice to consume
Yeah.
alcohol and be impaired.
Mm.
And some really good results and outcomes from our recent Operation Limit, which I won't talk about loads today, but what I would suggest is that consistent and coordinated approach to enforcement activity and other activity and media messaging across the UK does make a difference.
Yeah.
I think there's really good trust and confidence and public support for that drink drive activity. And again, having personally gone out and stood at the roadside with my colleagues
Yeah.
over the winter and stopped motorists, aside from those who we caught, the majority were really pleased to be stopped
Yeah.
at the roadside, even accepting that slight inconvenience to
Mm.
their journey. And I think there's academic support as well to say that it's really well received. I think you're right that the speeding is not seen as socially unacceptable, and yet we know that speed is a really significant factor, and on average, nearly 3,000 people killed or seriously injured in incidents where speeding is recorded as a factor. And I would suggest that probably the speed involved in other collisions may not always be recorded as accurately as perhaps it could. So that number could, in fact, be greater.
Mm. I mean, for me, it's it sort of begs belief that we're in this period of the social years, I suppose. I don't know, the time when we're doing so much to improve the safety of our vehicles, yet we still sit and have to discuss the behaviour of drivers and the social responsibility that falls out of being able to drive, and how some people abuse that. And for me, when we look at drug driving, any form of speeding, the risks that it imposes to those people around them, it must be almost soul destroying for, on a day-to-day basis for police officers to continually still have to face that and deal with it on a day-to-day basis. So what's the nugget? What's the message we can send out there that says, I suppose, what's the panacea that's going to sort of cure all this sort of stuff? Because, from the media, we see, 1 in 6 drivers still not wearing a seatbelt. We see an uplift in the number of drug drivers, despite police enforcement activity and heightened police enforcement activity at those key times of the year. Excess speed in excess of 2 million penalty notices a year. What can we do more? What can we do more? And what would you expect the public to do more? What would you want the public to do more to help in this arena?
Well, so I'm not sure there's any single answer that is the ideal solution to this. And if there is, if you could let me know, that would be great.
Harry Potter wand, yeah.
Exactly. I do think it is about a range of tactics and opportunities. And I guess the other bit for me, and when I look at the centre of the National Roads Policing Strategy, that talks about policing our roads together. For me, that's absolutely fundamental. And I think what I would sit here and say, and is starting to come to fruition and be reinforced by the outcomes we're seeing from those more coordinated and consistent operations across the country, is that where we work together, we can make a difference. And that is about police forces coming together and working in a more consistent and coordinated manner. It is about working with our partners. So whether that's National Highways, Motor Insurance Bureau, National Fire Chiefs Council, that's really important as well. And I think the more we can collaborate, have joint priorities, and working in an aligned fashion, that's really important. But also that policing our roads together is also about our road users and our public, and it is about people taking personal responsibility. And I think for me, that's a key aspect. I think a lot of people get behind the wheel and it's solely a purpose to get from A to B. What they don't necessarily think about is that risk that's associated with it. And yet we've talked already and highlighted some of those figures. But I think it's right to just reflect on them again. That's 17 minutes, which is probably we've been in here for twice that amount of time. So in the time we've been talking, Alan, 2 people in the UK would have been killed or seriously injured. We know the devastation that causes to friends, family, loved ones. And it is getting people to think about what they're doing and the risk they are creating on the road. And if people thought about the speed they were going, if they thought about what have I consumed, should I be behind the wheel, if they put their seatbelt on, we would start to reduce that risk quite significantly. So I guess for me, the summary of that would be that policing our roads together is about everybody playing their part in this. Yes, enforcement is a legitimate tactic. That's absolutely one of policing's role. But actually that level of personal responsibility for drivers to make sure they're fit to get behind the wheel, that they are compliant with the legislation that's in place to keep everybody safe, and they make the right choice, is also really, really important.
Oh, thanks for that. I couldn't agree more. The one I've left to last is probably the one that probably many people would say, yeah, it's one of the big risks. But there's also, I think, from my understanding, when I talk to people, a total lack of understanding about the risks that mobile phones bring to driving. And, many people say, but I talk to people next to me and, it's no different than that. And, so using the mobile phone, how can that be dangerous? What's your answer to that? How do you respond to that?
Well, clearly there's legislation in place in relation to handheld use of a mobile phone. And it's one of the fatal 4. We know it's a significant risk. And I guess what some of my academic colleagues would talk about as well is that distraction that takes place when you're talking on a mobile phone. And you've just touched on the difference between a person being in your vehicle. By no means am I the expert in this field, But what some of my academic colleagues would talk about is the fact that that person that you're talking to in a vehicle has that level of situational awareness in relation to where you are, whereas that other person on the other end of a phone doesn't. So I guess my message there would be any level of distraction is going to take your mind away from the task you're focusing on. And again, driving is a complex matter, isn't it? We're dealing with a constantly evolving landscape around us, with a changing road layout, geography, other moving vehicles, pedestrians, and actually the more attention we can give to focusing on our driving, the better.
Yeah.
So I guess the simple message would be the safest option is not to use your phone at all whilst you're behind the wheel.
Very succinctly put, thank you.
Yeah.
I think from my perspective, I mean, we at ZRS actually also recognise the dangers that these bring, and these issues are about choice. You know, every driver has the choice to do every one of these, which is why we're going to run a webinar in the coming weeks to actually, you know, which is open and available to everyone, free of charge, to come to and listen to me witter on even more about these issues. But the reality is, you know, they are choices, and we must remember that. And that, you know, many people are killed or injured as a result of our choices and our decisions that we make on a daily basis. And I mean, for me, Mark, I'd just like to sort of bring this session to a sort of closure, if that's okay with yourself, and sort of say, you know, thank you very much for joining us. I look forward to seeing the op limit results in the well, I suppose in the coming days, I suppose, and I look forward to seeing how targeted that's been, and I again look forward to. I hope we don't have any prosecutions around this, because everyone's got this message. I don't think I'm going to see that, but we hope. But Mark, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy day to join us for this webinar, and thank you again. Thank you for coming.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you.